Wargroove is a strategy tactics video game developed and published by Chucklefish. Released in 2019 and running on a custom-made game engine called Haley, it's available on the Switch, PS4, Xbox One, and the PC. The prevalence of nostalgia-style games is a really interesting phenomenon which seems to continue to gain steam as millennials and Gen Z continue to age. Chucklefish is known for capitalizing on this trend with games such as Stardew Valley and Starbound, and also maybe potentially exploiting hundreds of hours of work from volunteers, but we are not going to talk about that right now. Games are played in a turn-based style as you take turns leading your army against an AI or human opponent. There is also a very basic resource management system here where each village or town the player controls will give you a certain amount of funds which you can then buy different unit types with. The game draws heavy, and I mean heavy, influence from handheld tactical games from the early 2000s. Speaking of which, it is impossible to speak, nay to even think about Wargroove without mentioning its air quotes, inspiration, and air quotes because some people would say it's not inspired by as much as a direct copy of Advanced Wars. If you don't know Advanced Wars, you were probably born in the 2000s, and it is also a turn-based strategy from the War series, originally started in 1988, which built the primordial soup of the Wargroove game design. People also bring up comparisons to Fire Emblem, but it's pretty easy to see Advanced Wars is what they took most of the inspiration from. In Wargroove, movement, terrain, and attacking works pretty much the same, if not most of the time identical to Advanced Wars. While Wargroove adds new stuff, it often simplifies or takes away elements. This might be looked at as trimming the fat, but sometimes this reduces tactical depth. A big example of this is the unit joining feature, where in Advanced Wars, two units could merge together to heal. I'm pretty sure they tried to get this into Wargroove, but the point being is that the two games do have some key differences of varying degrees. Arguably, the biggest difference is the commander-style unit in Wargroove, which has a big risk and reward element, where it's a very powerful unit, but when it's taken out, that's game over. Devs introduced this concept as a way of combating what they attributed as a major pain point of the War series, which was grindy in-games. Wargroove absolutely wears this influence proudly on its sleeve, and it does not try to hide it whatsoever. However, it is important to note here that the near identical game design works both for and against the game as a whole. Mostly though, it's just fucking impossible to talk about this game without talking about Advanced Wars, so you've been warned, it's going to come up a lot in this video. The hype surrounding this game was real, because the last Advanced Wars style game came out in 2003, leaving a 16-year-old sized black hole in strategy-loving millennials everywhere. Well, unless they played the DS sequels Dual Strike or Days of Ruin, in which case it was a 13-year-old sized black hole, but people tend to remember Advanced Wars most memorably. The game was well received and nominated for a few Game of the Year awards. Currently in 2022, it has a very positive ranking on Steam, with a lot of players praising the gameplay, customizable content, and overall aesthetics. Financially, as far as I can tell, it broke even within the first week, and honestly, I'm happy for the devs. Seemed like it was a really small and passionate team working with some really hard deadlines. The game was self-funded as opposed to crowdfunding, which is honestly a bit interesting as Chucklefish's previous Starbound was in fact crowdfunded. I also just want to give a quick heads up about my background and relationship to the game. I am not a competitive pro multiplayer gamer, and although I have a ton of respect for these type of players as I think they keep the community going, I will not really be able to touch on the multiplayer component or specific tactics or ranking used in those matches. I'm mostly just going to be commenting on the general campaigns and other features of the game. That all being said, I probably did play around 40 hours of multiplayer local matches and custom-made maps with some of my friends, and I kinda wrecked them, so I'm probably secretly an A-tier player based on that, just saying. Some people have called the gameplay Advanced Wars refined. While I'm not sure this is exactly true, I would say it's more like an iteration of the gameplay, and there definitely is enough difference for it to be its own beast, for better or worse. An argument could definitely be made that the gameplay is simplified from Advanced Wars, but I honestly think it's just different, and it's kind of sad that they didn't really try to expand the gameplay a bit more. Probably the largest gameplay difference is the introduction of heroes. Hero and commander units are the most powerful type of unit in the game, but if they die, that's it, bitch. Game is over. Each commander has different grooves, which is a range of different powers of varying effects. For example, Mercia's power is Healing Aura, which restores 50% of health to all friendly units in a range of 3 tiles. The game dev likens the heroes to a mix of kings and queens in battle, with a big risk/reward element in there. This is probably one of the most interesting and unique aspects of the game, and I really can't imagine it without it. A huge distinguishing feature between the commander's grooves is something that isn't really broadcasted extremely well to the player, and that's the speed at which that the grooves themselves charge. Groove charges are determined by a few things. Basically, they get a small amount just by existing per turn, and also how much combat they're in, which again reinforces the risk and reward elements of the commanders. Some COs, like my boy Valder, can hit their charge within 1 or 2 turns, but other commanders, like Sedge, take fucking forever. Knowing how to get your groove on faster can really make all the difference in the world and add some really great depth to the game. Now, Advanced Wars had COs, and the heroes operate in the same way where they had powers which were similar to grooves. However, the grooves tend to be a lot more localized to just a couple tiles or a few units, which changes the dynamic and tactics by quite a bit. Also, in Advanced Wars, commanders had passive abilities, so for example, Max in Advanced Wars, he had tanks which were generally better than other CO's tanks. Wargroove does away with that, and the only difference are the grooves themselves between the commanders. It seems like, at some point, the devs wanted to have their own interpretation of the CO passive mechanic featured in Advanced Wars, but they just didn't have enough time to get it done. This is a shame because the commanders are all statistically the same, which doesn't make any fucking sense. How are you about to tell me a massive robotic thing does the same damage as a literal dog? This does make the gameplay more simplistic, but it honestly might have been a missed opportunity to add more depth. That being said, in the case of multiplayer, it does go a long way to make sure that the games are much more balanced. But yeah, it does feel a bit like a coward's way out. This would be a really fun thing to play around with. But I can see the reasoning behind the decision to make things more balanced. Units fight on a grid-based system and can move and attack at certain distances once per turn. Units are in many ways disposable and are pretty much meant to die, unlike your Fire Emblems. The principles are capture towns to earn cash, which will allow you to train new units from special buildings on the map, work out which units are strong against which, and try to avoid overextending yourself and then capture strategic points. Speaking of Fire Emblem, rock, paper, scissors type gameplay is implemented, where units are strong to one type but weak to another, although this is very poorly shown to the player, which we'll get to later. Each unit has the ability to do critical hits depending on if certain conditions are met. For example, spearmen being next to other spearmen units. The critical hit modifiers are pretty substantial and can be absolutely devastating, so it's very important to keep them in mind. The terrain and map play a large part in the gameplay, as well with the different terrains, each giving different defensive bonuses depending on the type. This is important because the gameplay heavily favors offensive play, where units almost always deal more damage when attacking rather than defending. Although units can die and are meant to be somewhat disposable, you can either heal from bases or heal from special abilities from units or commanding officer grooves. Understanding the unit's strengths, attack ranges, and critical hits, as well as defensive terrain, is absolutely crucial to playing well, as all of these directly factor into how much damage is dealt and how much is received. It sounds complicated, but it all comes together pretty naturally after a few games. A lot of the push and pull comes down to efficiency. Can you outproduce your opponent? Can you use tactics to pressure your opponent? Understanding effective trades is also a critical part of the game as well. It's kind of like chess. If you can consistently kill expensive enemy units with cheap units, you will be doing just fine. The ebb and flow of combat changes as you progress with different stages of gameplay, with the underlying principles pretty much the same. Capture towns to earn cash that allows you to mint new units from special buildings on the map, work out which units are strong against which, and try to avoid overextending yourself. Typically the games go something like this. First phase, getting as much property as possible. This stage is all about rushing to get more territory as fast as possible, which is why fast units such as wagons are so critical and why they get so much love on Reddit. Second phase, finding which areas will be contested on the map. If you're fighting close to your bases, you can use spearmen or trebuchets, as movement isn't really a big issue if you're defending. But if you're fighting a long way off without barracks, this really changes the dynamic of the game, as you really need to start to consider troop movement. The third phase is all about tactics. It's about slowly beating back your opponent in points of interest and understanding which tactics will be most effective at this and which units will be most effective. Once you're able to beat your opponent back, finally it comes down to either destroying the enemy base or destroying the enemy commander. This is honestly just a very general overview, and the flow of the game can change immensely depending on many different factors. I was kind of surprised to see a lot of people commenting on this game's difficulty, which, I think it's both fair and also in some ways maybe not so fair. The game is very balanced once you start understanding its rules, aside from a few edge cases, cough cough, fog of war. I think people's complaints, and I'm guessing here, comes from the campaign itself, where circumstances aren't really clearly communicated to the player. For example, your objective could be defending a set point from spawning waves of enemies, but the game doesn't really communicate when and how many waves of enemies will be spawning. The most egregious cases of this is if something completely unpredictable happens, like a bunch of units spawning in with no warning, and it's a bit cheap they have to resort to something like this that you have no way of preparing for. Actually, the AI isn't really that hard once you understand what makes these beautiful babies tick. They tend to group units together and almost always go for wagons or commanders, like this weird obsession. They also tend to stick units together, which leads them to neglecting entire regions of the map. Actually, it's kind of annoying how easy the AI is to beat on standard equal maps, and the game tends to overcompensate with this in campaign missions by stacking the game heavily in the AI's favor. But to be fair, this is nothing new in strategy games or games as a whole. A lot of the challenge is mostly due to the fact that there is no autosave or saving in the battles. While this does prevent save scumming, this does make longer games, especially those in the campaign, extraordinarily tedious if you lose. So there can easily be situations where after you invest an hour or an hour and a half in a game, out of fucking nowhere a commander uses some crazy attack and one-shots your commander to death, then you lose and have to start all over. No, I am not bitter, I am just using this purely as an example. The unit roster doesn't really deviate too heavily from Advanced Wars, with basically all of the same units included. Essentially, you have your infantry with standard swordsmen being the cheap fodder, attack dogs used for fast-moving cheap units, which allegedly can see easily in the fog, and spearmen as a solid defensive unit. Then, for heavier options, you have knights, which are fast-moving, hard-hitting units, and golems, which are expensive but extremely tough. You also have transport units, which are critical for moving units around quickly on larger maps. Air and sea are options as well, although they don't have much in the way of variety, but enough to make it dynamic and interesting. The mage units really are a standout, and they fill both the abilities of anti-air and a healer role. Although the healing ability from the mages comes at a cost of 300 G, which can be a bit expensive. However, because the healing has an AoE effect, when used correctly, it can be well worth the cost. Some of the sea units are amphibious type units which can move on both land and sea and are welcome new additions to the game, as well as they really help make the naval units more dynamic and playable. While the roster is a bit limited and it's a shame there aren't more changes from Advanced Wars, on the upside it is fairly balanced. The balance might be one of the best things about Wargroove, especially compared to Advanced Wars, and I did feel as if I used all units on a pretty regular basis. And if I didn't, I could see how they could be used with viable strategies. You know, it's funny seeing the reputation some units get with people being absolutely horny for wagons, although I can see the reason. When given the right condition, these fuckers can cross half the map. Spearmen and trebuchets also get a bad or an infamous rep, because if these guys are stacked side by side in decent numbers, there's not really shit you can do. That being said, I do like both of these units, and I think they did try to nerf them in post-game patches. The game devs did apparently play around with the addition of new additional units, like the assassin character, but it wouldn't be until the addition of the DLC that you get some interesting new ideas being used. You know, it's hard to fault the game devs here because on one hand, the unit roster is very balanced, which I know is one of their goals, but it does feel like a bit of a shame there wasn't more experimentation done here. I mean, I'm definitely a fan of keeping things minimal and balanced with the roster, but it does begin to feel a bit repetitive because only so many strategies are really viable with the current roster of units, especially in conjunction with how each of the playstyles of the commanders is identical outside of their grooves, and the fact that factions are the same apart from cosmetics. Speaking of factions, there are 4 main factions in the vanilla game and 12 commanding officers excluding secret commanders, with about 3 per faction. Factions function identically in terms of gameplay with only cosmetic differences between the units. The faction aesthetics are simple, but honestly speak to each of their cultures. For example, the Felheim ballistas are pretty much the same design as Cherrystone's ballistas, but the Felheim includes some really brutal spikes. These little details really help add a lot of much needed personality to the factions, but you know, again, this is something which I feel like might have been an area the devs could have explored with different units, so maybe you have different abilities for units between the factions to help them feel more unique. Although, again, I don't want to beat this home too much, but the upside of the system that's currently in use is that the factions are completely balanced, for better or for worse. Cherrystone Kingdom is basically your standard Humie boys, but with a slight magical accent. Think your bog standard knights and dragons with Western European fare. Although there are some exceptions, they are made up mostly of humans. Interestingly enough, Cherrystone is both the name of their kingdom and also the name of a magic crystal which powers some of their units, or in the case of Emeric, acts as a defensive shield. Then you have the Felheim Legion. Basically, take a 4-year-old's imagination of the most comically evil faction you can think of, and you have Felheim. They are a nation comprised of undead in a frozen hellscape, ruled by a necromancer and an evil dom vampire queen. Actually, I think there could have been some interesting nuances in their design. Maybe you could have something similar to Divinity Original Sin, where the undead had their own culture and backstory. But here, we just have unequivocally evil skeletons trying to murder everything. Although, to be fair, later in the game, they are shown to have some other shades than just pure evil. Although one could argue that Felheim is the most progressive of any of the factions, as they actually have the most diverse amount of any races of any of the factions, with undead, humans, vampires, bats, and even turtles. The commanders tend to have a more Eastern European name structure, and their grooves focus on more aggressive playstyles. Also, I'm not sure why legions are almost always the bad guys in video games. Then you got the Heavensong Empire in the hotter climate of the West, ruled by Empress Tinnery. Heavensong is a very Eastern-inspired faction, with all of the commanders having Japanese names. It's also another all-human faction, including Shibas as a unit. Is that a first in video games? I don't know. One of the most distinguishing characteristics of Heavensong is that all of the human units, including the commanders, wear different masks which apparently symbolize different things. Finally, you have one of the most interesting factions from a design perspective, and that is the Florians. They are aliens, but they are also plants. Seems really out of place in this setting, and that's because, they actually are. In an act of genius or laziness, Chucklefish recycled this faction from Starbound, apparently as one of their commanders, Noru. Apparently, it's canon that both games are set in the same universe. I haven't played Starbound, so I can't comment on how feasible this joining is, but there is a chaotic part of me that does love how random this faction is. Also, the fact that they literally eat humans. The main campaign could be probably best described as serviceable and definitely will not be winning any awards. It's probably why in most reviews people tend to take more time talking about the extra features and game modes like the map editor and cutscene editor. It does do a decent enough job as acting to an introduction to the gameplay, slowly introducing new unit types and strategies throughout the 21 main missions and 12 optional side missions. Sometimes Wargroove gets a bit of a bad rep as a direct Advanced Wars clone, like they are exactly the same game. While in principle they definitely are the same in some pretty key gameplay areas, they do have enough to separate them into two distinct entities. It's actually really interesting to see where the devs decided to change the format of the game and what stayed the same, as they probably had a lot of time, like over a decade, to really reflect on what was working and what wasn't. The devs said on multiple occasions when designing Wargroove, they really tried to make the in-game less grindy than in Advanced Wars. In service of this, they introduced the commanders on the field that could be killed and in the game, and also how building captures now can be completed in a single turn. Commanders' powers have also been changed. Whereas in Advanced Wars, you got an active commander ability which functioned similar to a groove, as well as a passive ability. So, for example, some commanders in Advanced Wars would boost certain unit types. It's very interesting that Wargroove didn't choose to do the same. On the plus side, though, you do have an introduction of critical hits in Wargroove, which definitely adds another layer to the tactics. And another plus area is the iteration of the water units compared to the Advanced Wars ones. Sea units are cheaper, and the introduction of sea villages makes water honestly more strategic and valuable. Also, mer people can go on land, making them much more flexible and dangerous. Now, Wargroove did elect to simplify a decent number of mechanics. The most notable is the absence of supplies. In Advanced Wars, a unit could run out of ammo and not be able to fire, or worse, run out of fuel and not be able to move. Units needed to be resupplied either with certain units or at bases. A more questionable exclusion is the absence of healing units by joining. Apparently, the game devs wanted to include this but lacked the time. It's unfortunate they never had time to do this, as it really adds an extra layer of gameplay depth where you could bring two damaged units together, where if one unit had 5 health and another unit of the same type also had 5 health, you could join them together into one unit with full health, which is especially handy since damage is modified by the percentage of health a unit has. It's just frustrating sometimes that with these exclusions, the devs in many ways simplified some of the game mechanics, which, seeing that one of the target demographics for this game is probably just older fans of Advanced Wars, I think we could have handled more complexity rather than less. Aggressive tactics are pretty heavily favored in Wargroove. This is shown front and center with the huge bonus attacking units get compared to defenders, even when terrain bonus is applied. Early positioning and taking strategic points is important to do. Now that villages can heal, generate income, and act as a physical barrier preventing units moving across them, they are actually extremely important and can easily be turned into mini forts. Checking attack range and getting a feel for this is extremely important. Nothing is worse than spending $1 million Wargroove bucks on an expensive dragon just to have it blown apart by a goddamn harpoon ship that fires from the other end of the fucking universe. Keeping in mind weaknesses and strengths in conjunction with how and when criticals can be performed is huge, which can be a bit tricky to learn as they aren't really telegraphed to the players that well. This adds a really nice layer of depth to the gameplay because criticals are determined by positioning rather than luck, so knowing how best to utilize your units can make or break positions, especially because critical hits can do more than double damage in some instances. Although, speaking of criticals, some of the conditions that trigger these can be a bit situational. So for example, Aeronaut's critical only triggers while over mountains, but like if there's no mountains on the map, you're kind of out of luck. A huge turning point in the game for me was when I stopped looking at my units as people with hopes and dreams, and more as dollar signs expressing their intrinsic value. If I could sacrifice a unit worth $400 to take out an enemy worth 1,000, you can best believe that guy is going home in a casket. Because at the end of the day, a huge part of the game is being able to outproduce your opponent, it's very important to always look at when to fight and when to run away in an economic sense. I don't know if this is a community strategy or not, but I had a lot of luck with trying to maximize the number of units I had on the map at all costs and doing my best to keep them alive. It sounds pretty simple, but it was pretty fun and rewarding to have like 50 units at any given time, even if they all are cheap swordsmen, because it really increases your options and flexibility. Another huge advantage to this was that it let me put constant pressure on my enemy. So yeah, pretty much the same tactics as the Red Army, just throw wave and wave of cheap infantry at them till they give up in sheer frustration. We've already touched a bit on this on the video, but unfortunately the AI isn't really smart or adaptive enough to make the game challenging. They tend to focus on certain units and lash out seemingly randomly. You can really see it struggle in 4-person games where they either aggressively try to hunt one person down or lash out aimlessly. The problem is the AI doesn't really know how to rush or press advantages in a meaningful way, so it gives ample time for players to respond to situations. Another interesting gameplay mechanic is the weather. Apparently it's a factor, and to be honest, I almost never noticed it in the campaign or even playing locally in multiplayer. It's absolutely bizarre because it played a pretty significant factor in the Advanced Wars game, with some of the commanders being able to change the weather and work better in certain conditions. That being said, I can also understand reducing the randomness aspect of the weather because something like snow in the original Advanced Wars would completely bog down your entire operation significantly. But the way it's implemented in Wargroove is bizarre because the devs seem to either be embarrassed or maybe unsure about it, because I don't think weather effects are even explained to the player, at least not in the campaign. So what I'm talking about is there are apparently 3 different weather types. Neutral, which has no impact on your units. Favorable, which increases ground and naval unit speeds by 1 or 2 spaces, and also increase flying unit damage. And severe weather, which does the exact opposite of favorable. It kind of all feels so subtle and like an afterthought, and it just goes to show it's either barely noticeable or I'm a huge dumbass because I didn't even notice these features in my first 40 hours of gameplay. Fog of War, in theory, adds another layer of tactics and strategy to the game, obscuring the player's vision to only what your units can actually see. Makes a ton of new engaging strategies possible, as ambushes and sneak and flanking attacks suddenly become viable. Also, maybe one of the most interesting aspects of Fog of War is that you can't actually see what your opponent is producing, and therefore you have to guess which units to make. I found myself starting to make much more balanced formations of units and playing much more defensively, and it was honestly great. The problem came when I started playing against the AI and realized they just completely ignore Fog of War. I wonder if the devs realize this, and that's why it's only utilized like twice in the whole campaign. Also, there are a few aspects of Fog of War which aren't really clearly communicated to the player. For example, dogs, right? In the campaign, they make this big deal out of how dogs can see further than other units in Fog of War. But this is actually not entirely true. Dogs actually don't see further than other units, but they actually just see through trees. This and the weather really goes to show that some mechanics just are not explained that clearly to the player outside of the codex at all, which is a shame because there is potential in this mode of play. Alright, so we're dropped into the story on a dark and rainy night in Cherrystone Castle, the heart of Cherrystone Kingdom, and where the current king, King Merciful, resides. The map looks pretty huge, but actually most of it is unplayable, and it's really just a straight shot to the end. We're playing as a mysterious woman who will turn out to be the internet's OG vampire mommy dami, Sigrid of Felheim. Cough cough, fuck you, Resident Evil. This mission basically acts as a tutorial showing how movement, basic attack, and commands work. Nothing crazy here. Anyway, we slaughter a few hapless guards, working our way into the king's chambers. You can actually fail this mission if you decide to go off the rails and try to barge into one of the other chambers. Our glorious Dom vampire character confronts the old king as he is pondering to tell his daughter and heir to the throne Mercia his secret, which, goddammit, of course he doesn't do. Sigrid demands a key, which he refuses, and at which point Sigrid bitch slaps him to death, triggering a war between Cherrystone Kingdom and the Felheim Legion. Now that we've instigated an international conflict, we can see the world map, which is fairly detailed and honestly kinda cute. There are 8 major areas with a few biomes of grass, desert, forest, and snow. We can't see the political lines, but the continent is home to Felheim in the south, Cherrystone in the west, the Florian lands in the north, and the Lost Leagues / Heavensong in the east. The island of Dragon's Cradle is directly in the center of the map, rather ominously. It's a shame most of the map is purely aesthetic though, and we won't actually get to go to many locations. We can also view the codex on the world map, and it's really a nice touch, allowing you to learn more about the lore, settings, and characters. I especially got a kick out of the character's least favorite thing, like what is this about? The next mission has us transported to a peaceful field where the now princess and soon-to-be Queen of Cherrystone is practicing her swordsmanship with her dog, as well as the royal mage Emeric. It's important to note here that the cherry blade, which is what she is wielding, is a royal heirloom of the Cherrystone Kingdom. Merciful, the old king, didn't possess it because I guess he used the saber or some other lame shit. Anyway, Mercia is informed of the king's death and that it was a vampire who did the dirty. Fucking Emeric, in all his wisdom, decides that this is an act of war with like 0 diplomatic inquiries or anything, which may or may not bite us in the ass later, I don't know. Several months later, Mercia is coronated as queen, and suddenly, out of nowhere, the Felheim Legion attacks Cherrystone. Mercia, for some reason, is completely surprised by this, which is a bit fucking peculiar, because what has she been doing for the past months after her father was literally murdered by an alleged Felheim assassin? Was she preparing her kingdom for war, tending to the kingdom's southern defenses? I guess not. I guess she was just chilling. Anyway, she goes off to fight the invasion, and the fight begins. There's honestly nothing much going on in this mission as far as challenge or complexity. It's just another tutorial showing the basics of combat, villages, and terrain, so we're just gotta move on. The third mission is more of the same, with Mercia continuing to defend against the invasion. Mercia complains that the kingdom is overrun, but again, geopolitically, it seems like Felheim and Cherrystone were never on great terms, with hordes from Felheim occasionally plundering the borders, or even full-scale invasions, so it's kind of on her for not preparing for this invasion, at all. Anyway, we're introduced to one of the commanders of Felheim's army, Ragna, who is a patchwork creation made with different parts of quote-unquote history's greatest warriors, which is metal and also a little bit gross. Apparently, she is actually 5 years old mentally, so it's kind of questionable to let her, lead an army. As far as gameplay, this mission functions as a tutorial mostly on archers, capturing buildings, and recruiting units from barracks. With Ragna defeated, she insists on a rematch, and the next battle is kind of a continuation of the battle we were just fighting, except where Ragna and Mercia personally fight on the battlefields, and it serves as yet another tutorial, but this time for cavalry, commanders, and strongholds. It's honestly just an extremely straightforward mission where we can easily crush Ragna given that we have a unit and income advantage. At the end of each mission, we are awarded a ranking depending on our performance. It's not really made clear by the game, but this is entirely based on speed of completion, which for some missions makes it extremely difficult to achieve S rank. Gone are the days of Advanced Wars where you are awarded currency to purchase additional in-game content. Here the ranks primarily give you access to secret missions, endings, and even characters down the road. There is no RPG or leveling system at the end of each mission for better or worse, which again, I can see how this would completely change the dynamic of the game, but might have been one solution to add some much needed replayability in the campaign. With Ragna defeated, we are introduced to Valdor, the ruler of Felheim Legion and the de facto edgelord of the game. Basically, as soon as he shows up, Emeric decides to fucking retreat from Cherrystone, which seems like a bit drastic of a decision. What is the plan here? Why didn't you guys make a goddamn contingency plan in the first place? Actually, between automatically assuming Felheim wanted war and this extremely questionable decision, Emeric has been a terrible advisor. Come to think of it, looking at his picture, my guy looks like he might be drunk off the Cherrystone juice, if you know what I'm saying. Why are we not defending the castle from the very first mission? What is even the plan after we go to Gloomwoods? Fuck it. Anyway, Mercia takes it upon herself to defend villagers fleeing from Valdor's army as it arrives. Gameplay-wise, it's still another tutorial, mostly showcasing how wagons work as well as commander grooves. After we successfully escape, Valdor sends both his minions, both Ragna and Sigrid, after us, so right now the crew is not only running around with no plan, but actively being hunted by two undead commanders. To his credit, Emeric does stop and try to formulate a plan here. Apparently what he wants to do is get reinforcements from the friendly nation of Heavensong, but the issue therein is that happens to literally be on the other end of the world. Listen, I know they needed to start the characters at a low and have this globe-trotting adventure, but I think the thing that gets me is the months-long gap between the king's death and the invasion, and how seemingly unprepared literally everyone in Cherrystone was. The The crew escapes to Gloomwood, and the deficiencies in Emeric's plan are immediately laid bare when we are ambushed by the Florians, the man-eating plant/alien creature faction from Starbound. Also, to be fair to Emeric, apparently under an agreement, the Cherrystone has right to safe passage through the Gloomwoods that Felheim cannot follow, but it seems like this agreement was always tenuous at best. And also, to be fair to the enemy commander Sedge here, who is the commander of the Florians, it seems like he's motivated purely by hunger, so I guess I just don't fault him. He's just a hungry boy, aren't we all? Gameplay-wise, this is our first taste of Fog of War, for better or worse. I could see how this map might be difficult for first-time players, as the enemy has access to a barracks and can produce units initially while the player cannot. The map forces you to play rather conservatively and smart with your units. This is actually further reinforced by the game letting us play with Emeric for the first time, who heavily favors defense with his Groove, which materializes a crystal that casts a defensive bonus to any friendly unit in its range. After defeating Sedge, the Florian king, Greenfinger, arrives on the scene. Greenfinger and Emeric must have a lot in common because without pausing to take any second thought or questioning, he accepts Sedge's story that the Cherrystone forces are arriving purely to attack Gloomwood. This seems kind of strange because Sedge seems like a really sketchy guy, but whatever. Also, it seems strange because I find it odd that Greenfinger doesn't recognize Mercia or at the very least Emeric. He's apparently 118, so I guess he should be at least wary of Sedge at this point. And didn't the King of Cherrystone send out diplomatic envoys? Aren't there embassies in this game? Oh god, we're just gotta move on. The next mission immediately throws us into combat with Greenfinger. This map also includes Fog of War again, but also throws in the introduction of trebuchet and giant units. Nothing really terrible as far as difficulty, and we're able to continue to use our defensive formations to easily break Greenfinger down. Afterward, another Florian commander, Noru, jumps in to mediate the situation. Once Greenfinger calms down and we're able to explain the situation, he seems much more hospitable, even giving us Noru as an ally and sends us on our way. Story-wise, not much happens in the next mission. Ragna catches up with the party, but is easily beaten off by Mercia. The game continues its slow tutorial with the introduction of flying units and anti-air units. I do find it interesting that even Mercia is starting to get sick of Ragna at this point, and pretty much reluctantly fights her. In various interviews, the devs stated they wanted to try to implement branching paths in the campaign, but unfortunately weren't able to due to deadlines. It's definitely unfortunate this wasn't included because I can see how some moments in the campaign would have greatly benefited from the options where your choices lead to different outcomes. As I said before, the campaign has very little replay value, with the only reason being to go for higher rankings. Having branching paths would have gone a long way to fix this, and it really is a shame. Another nitpick of the campaign and the paths is that you can't easily go from one end of the campaign map to another. There is no mission selector screen, and if you're all the way at one end of the map, you have to fucking manually move all the way back. After departing from the Gloomwoods, we make our way to the Lost Leagues, an ancient battleground. En route, Emeric decides to make a stop in the marshlands, as apparently the barrier between living and dead in the area is very thin, and he may be able to use it to communicate with the old King Merciful. But, interestingly enough, he doesn't even say why he wants to do so, furthermore stating it would be impossible for Mercia to communicate with him, which I find honestly noteworthy, as I'm not sure why the game devs wouldn't want to use this opportunity to have Mercia speak with her father, as A, it would be more heartfelt, and B, it might resonate more with the themes that are shown later in the game. From a gameplay point of view, this is one of the more unique missions, with us commanding Emeric and a small group of followers to various points on the map to communicate with Merciful. At each point, we glean tiny morsels of information from the deceased king before a fresh wave of enemies arrives. It's a great idea to kind of parse this expedition dump in the midst of gameplay instead of an overtly long cutscene, which they easily could have done here. So, in the midst of battle, Merciful warns Emeric of a greater threat than Felheim, one from an ancient time called Requiem. Requiem was apparently created during the war known as the Great Dissonance, fought between, I'm gotta mispronounce this, sorry, Cacophony and Silmor, two nations that ruled the world before the current four factions came to be. Requiem is a god-tier weapon, which is a conscious embodiment of hate and destruction, craving pure devastation. Unfortunately, before telling Emeric anything more, Merciful is spirited away, which is quite convenient because, spoilers, he leaves out a very critical detail. In the next mission, we are again reminded of the ever-present threat of Felheim pursuing us when Sigurd catches up with us. In actually back-to-back unique missions, we command both Mercia and Noru with the goal of having Mercia reach the other end of the map while being harassed by Sigurd's forces and Noru backing up our retreat. This is actually a really interesting use of the story missions to try to push the limits of the system. The expansions would expand on these ideas of having two commanders pursue different objectives. This is also the first time dragons appear in the story, and they really could pose a significant threat to the unaware player as their critical is triggered when attacking a unit on the road, and seen as it's very possible for Mercia to be on a road in this mission, you could easily be caught unaware. However, with good use of wagons and air support, we easily outrun Sigrid, although, to be honest, I would have loved to be caught by her, just saying. Having evaded the Felheim assault, our group finally gets through the Lost Leagues and on their way to the Heavensong border. After finally arriving at their destination, instead of being greeted with open arms, we are instead received more with swords in hand. The Heavensong border guards see Noru in our party and immediately assume that they are under Florian attack, which, I don't know what it is about this world and people just automatically assuming they are being invaded. I mean, this Song of Dance is honestly getting a bit stale and a little bit lazy on the game devs for resorting to the same excuse for us to battle different factions. This map is one of the first real, just typical multiplayer style maps in the way that its positioned is evenly stacked, aside from the fact that the enemy already has all the bases on their side occupied, which, given the situation and how we are invading Heavensong, makes total sense. That being said, actually, this mission really highlights just how poor the AI is, especially without a commander and additional resources. It turns out to be a very easy fight. Immediately after defeating the border guards, the Heavensong general in the area, Ryoto, arrives to fend off our quote-unquote invasion. Mercia tries to explain the situation, but unfortunately for us, is terrible at diplomacy. You think that we keep Noru and the Florians in the rear guard, but nope, Noru is front and center when Ryoto arrives, giving this man all the excuse he needs for a genocidal war. I mean, not to belabor the point, but don't they have a fucking CIA or some intelligence agency? At this point, I'm with Caesar, who's just fucking checked out, sniffing some random shit on the ground, because no one in this game has any idea what's going on. Whew, okay. As far as gameplay, I actually like this mission. Again, it's more of a straightforward battle where you finally kind of feel the training wheels start to come off. It's basically the same as last mission, but including flying units and an enemy general to contend with in the form of Ryoto. And it's honestly really good to just play some standard matches. Indirectly, this is kind of teaching you how to use wagons, and the map is littered with long roads to reinforce this. Additionally, the Heavensong maps all feature heavy use of walls, which obviously limit movement and options a fair amount. Interestingly, even flying units can't go through walls, which is a little bit confusing. Actually, this is the first mission I lost because fucking Ryoto did his dash move and went halfway across the goddamn map to murk my queen, which fortunately I did not capture on the camera. The Prince of the Empire, Koji, arrives on the scene to back Ryoto up. And yet, again, there is literally no reason to even have this battle. At this point, even Ryoto is saying, listen, my guy, we don't need to fight. But I guess this is what happens when you let literal children lead your armies. Koji's enormous puppet really does highlight, however, how different commanders should have different stats, as this thing is almost as big as a golem unit. Which, speaking of, we are finally able to command giants in this battle, and they prove invaluable at turning the tides of the conflict. After brutally putting down this 12-year-old with magic titans, we are introduced to the Empress herself, Tinri, who, annoyingly enough, immediately clears up the confusion and professes to be an ally of us. Tinri gives us safe passage as well as sailors, and then has us babysit Koji. God damn it. I think the thing that really bothers me about the end of the Heavensong campaign as well as the Gloomwood campaign is how contrived the fighting sequences were at the start and how quickly they assaulted us and how just as quickly we became their allies. It just seems like very lazy story writing, and it's also annoying that they literally do this back to back right after another. Again, I understand that the devs wanted us to have this globetrotting adventure, picking up allies along the way, but honestly, with how quickly both Gloomwood and Heavensong turned on a dime to become our allies, it's making me a little bit sus. I mean, are they trying to lure Cherrystone away into a foreign conflict, kind of like what Germany did with Nicholas I of Russia against Japan? I don't know. I guess beggars can't be choosers, and we need all the men we can get, so we're just got to go for it. After departing Heavensong, the group is set upon by Sedge, which is a bit confusing given how the entire premise of the very recent Cherrystone and Heavensong war was that Florians equal bad and are not allowed in Heavensong. So this begs the question, how did he get through Heavensong? Anyway, you play as Emeric and Koji in another two-commander style mission, with Emeric going to take control of some Emberwing dragons, while Koji stays back to defend against Sedge's attack and buy Emeric time. I do kind of love how fucking Emeric throws this child at this crazed plant/alien hybrid creature flanked by giants, but I guess I can't blame him. This mission functions as a tutorial for dragons and balloons, and also introduces Koji's Groove, which deploys 2 bombs that act as kamikaze-style units and do a splash damage effect. It can be a tricky map if you aren't careful just for the sheer overwhelming amount of Sedge's forces, which require the smart use of defensive and anti-air units to manage until the dragons can come to the rescue. Afterward, we arrive at a port and it's randomly being attacked by Felheim. It's honestly a bit of a mystery why and how Felheim is attacking over here at the other end of the world, but it's possible I missed something? But actually, this is a good point here. I mean, what is Felheim's goal in this conflict? What are their long-term strategic aims? We understand that Sigrid is actively seeking out something, but actually, I don't understand what Valdor himself wants, which should be more important as he is the ruler of Felheim. I really just have to stop questioning this campaign and just get through it at this point. Anyway, on a bright note, the Mer people are a work of genius. These beans are so wholesome and perfect, it makes me want to cry. I guess they call to some weird sort of kink deep within me, but that's something I'm going to have to explore personally later. This mission introduces boats, and it's the first time you have access to land, sea, and air units all in the same map. It's also a stark reminder that units cannot fly over walls, which would have been very helpful here. The Sea Fleet is kind of a red herring, as these units are completely pointless as you can't access them. Regardless, after securing the port, we embark on our long-awaited invasion of Felheim. The crew is intercepted by Felheim naval forces, commanded by Aragna, in our first and only all-naval battle. Although, you can also recruit air units here as well. This is our introduction and tutorial on naval warfare and introduces amphibians, turtles, harpoon ships, warships, barges, ports, and water villages. It's an extremely easy and quick victory, as this is one of the very few times in the campaign the enemy's starting advantage is negligible. At the end, Ragna literally fucking drowns, and Mercia, in one of the most savage moments in her questionable career, just fucking says, "Oh," and walks away. Fucking burn. Then Sigrid randomly flies over and comes to the conclusion that the cherry blade is the key, rather mysteriously. How and why she arrives at this conclusion, I have no idea, but there you go. Having achieved naval supremacy, we've cleared our way to invade the Felheim mainlands. Our invasion begins in earnest with a coordinated joint land-sea assault with different branches of our military led by the separate commanders we picked up along the way. All three commanders' armies function as one team. Though different in color and faction style, we command them effectively as one force, which is another prelude to what the DLC would explore more. Although you'd think allowing the player three commanders would be a bit OP, because of Felheim's huge starting bonus in terms of economy and units, it's a pretty challenging map. It's also the first time the player has access to all recruiting centers, and in a way is a test for using all different unit types, land, sea, air, in conjunction with one another as we storm the Felheim mainland. While the rest of the commanders are making a beachhead, Mercia and Caesar decide to split up and go behind enemy lines to face Valdor alone. Mercia has a moment of doubt and thinks the world is quote-unquote broken, but then gets strong and says she can overcome by believing in herself. You know, the issue is that there's literally no character development. Mercia doesn't have any hang-ups aside her dad dying, which admittedly is a terrible thing for a daughter to go through. But the problem is she just goes from battle to battle, decimating every opponent with seemingly boundless optimism. So sometimes when the game during these final few missions throws out these themes of believing in oneself and the power of friendship, not only does it feel generic as fuck, but it also is completely unearned because the campaign didn't use its time to develop anything aside the story of Requiem. I get the game isn't taking itself so seriously, and it doesn't need to have some deep message, but it's just very confusing when at the 11th hour, they have Mercia spit out this kind of kindergarten tier theme message. It just kind of gives me a bit of whiplash. Anyway, moving on from my hate, our mission is to take out Valdor in his fortress. We only have a set amount of units, and we cannot produce any more. It's kind of the inverse of the previous mission, where it's testing your tactical abilities instead of economic. By this point, the mission shouldn't be too terrible in terms of difficulty, mostly because you have infinite healing in the form of Mercia and the OP power of Caesar, which allows you to move units within a small radius twice in one turn. Valdor can spawn infinite sword units, but it's really not too much of a hassle to take him out. With him easily defeated, Mercia demands for the war to end, but is surprised when Sigrid, who comes out of left field, takes the cherry blade. Valdor realizes Sigrid must have killed King Merciful, and is the reason this war began in the first place, becoming furious as Sigrid exits stage left. Mercia and Valdor realize the cherry blade is the key that would unlock Requiem, and accept each other's aid to stop Sigrid. Okay, so this is all fine, but again, it calls into question Valdor's whole motivation in the war. The big thing here that I don't understand after playing through the campaign a couple times is what the fuck did he think happened to Merciful? I had always assumed he knew Sigrid killed the king, but if he didn't, then literally, why did the war start? Did he just randomly decide to invade Cherrystone? Which, in that case, he's just as guilty as Sigrid, so I don't know why he's acting innocent here. I really gotta stop questioning, so we're just gotta move on, okay? Okay, so we made it. The final act whereupon Requiem's secrets are finally revealed to us. This is actually a good spot to mention. As we've been progressing in the campaign, we've been picking up more and more allies along the way, and I find it extremely strange you can't play as different commanders in the campaign. It's obvious that the devs intended the campaign to have replay value, which is why they were probably aiming for branching paths in the first place. Since they decided to take this out, it's weird they didn't include different commander options to play as in the different maps to help give some replay value, especially since a big part of the campaign is picking up commanders as you go along. I feel at the very least they could have added this to players once they finish the campaign at least once. Also, toying around these goofballs makes me realize it's interesting they didn't use the different nationalities of the commanders to flesh out culture and vibe of each faction and the dynamics between them. They seem to primarily focus on the personalities of the commanders themselves and the relationships between them, which is fair, but I think if one of the major hooks of the game is the personality of the world, fleshing out this world and the powers in it would have really set the groundwork for a lasting IP. And as a result, the game feels a little bit flat and kind of small. And even with the story focusing more on the personality of the characters, we don't really get a lot of insight into their motivations. Sure, I can understand Mercia's aim is to avenge her father and take back her kingdom, but why is Noru here? Why is Valdor? Again, I know with the aesthetic, it's not trying to be anything deep, but is it too much to ask for at least something to grab onto here? The crew gets to the spot Sigrid just left the cherry blade on the ground at, which is kind of a bit funny. They then find the sword, and for some reason Sigrid pops out to say hello. I don't know why she would do this instead of finishing her mission to obtain a Requiem when she's so close. Does she just love talking shit? I have no idea, but I still love her. Mercia decides to confront her on her own to avenge her father. Like they kind of just did this with Valdor, but here we go again, I guess. I also love that Sigrid is just so fucking done with Mercia's shit when she is getting all heartfelt with Emeric, saying how much he means to her. Sigrid just says she is going to throw up, and honestly, I feel her. Okay, so it's a pretty standard mission, actually seems more equal than most, and it's just a straight up multiplayer type fight. It does have a unique asset in the form of this giant volcano in the north, which is pretty interesting. I used the power of wagons and spamming spearmen to shamelessly defeat her, but I do have to hand it to her, it did take me a while. I'm honestly not even sure why it gave me so much trouble, as both sides of the map are pretty even. Again though, I love how Sigrid just shit talks the entire time, and also love how at the end, Mercia just fucking stabs her. I mean, I gotta say, it's so funny when the characters brutally murder each other in this cute pixel art setting. Just something about the juxtaposition, I don't know. But this does actually showcase a potential shortcoming with the cutesy pixel style, where it works fine when the tone is lighthearted, but some things might be lost in translation during these darker moments. At the end, the A-Team realizes that in order to finally end the threat of Requiem, we need to go into the breach and fight Requiem itself. We are confronted by a woman, a phantom princess of one of the ancient kingdoms, wielding Requiem itself. Unfortunately, we are unable to convince the spirit of the princess to stand down and let us destroy Requiem, and are forced to fight it. We soon learn the power of Requiem, which can turn the hearts of men. With this, the princess enthralls seemingly our entire army aside from the commanders. The final mission, a unique circumstance where we command each and every allied commander and no grunts. On top of that, periodically each of the commanders will fall under Requiem's spell and attack us for our turn. Actually, the difficulty here mostly stems from the fact that if a single commander dies, we have to start all over again. On top of that, when the commanders are under Requiem's control, they magically have their groove fully charged, and they use it with reckless abandon, making it very difficult to account for their actions. The best strategy here is to move the commanders away from the main force when they start to fall under the spell, and play extremely slowly and very carefully. With the princess defeated, Mercia somehow pieces together that the secret Merciful wanted to tell Mercia was that he meant for her to look after Requiem and keep it safe. Despite literally everyone telling her not to, Mercia grabs Requiem in an attempt to finally defeat it. So, of course, within 5 seconds, Requiem tries to take control of Mercia. In this mental battle, Mercia faces off against the dark side of herself. Ugh. Basically, it's almost identical style missions as when we assaulted Valdor's fortress. We have a set limit of units and need to use them wisely as we won't get any more. We are faced with a huge number against us, and in a nice detail, it's actually the same map as the very first mission in the game. Although at first it appears overwhelming, once you make your way into the castle, the tight quarters actually work in your favor of your much smaller force, and really it just becomes a long slog to carefully advance your forces, heal with Mercia, and continue. It's actually a shame they didn't try anything new here, as I feel the whole mine battle theme could have had some very interesting gameplay repercussions. So, Mercia says she defeats Requiem by staying true to the ideals of her father and her friends. Requiem says she will lose more again in the future, rather ominously. After Requiem is finally defeated, we all go back to Cherrystone Kingdom, and Mercia has a proper celebration with all the commanders, and a peace has been secured across the lands. So, at the end of the day, friendship won, and the ideals of the old king were upheld, and the last scene is Mercia at the gravestone of her father, saying he was so wise. But what did he even do? We never saw him being wise. Why did this story need to be told? Why did this message need to be said? There was no interesting questions or scenarios brought up at all. If there were going to be branching paths as the devs originally intended, this would have helped so much. Maybe we could have had a Dark Mercia path where she embraces it and we fuck up everything. The target demographic is old enough, so I don't understand why something more interesting couldn't have been explored. This entire campaign is obviously just so hollow, and it doesn't say a thing, which is bizarre because they obviously wanted players to experience it in order to unlock some of the basic modes and characters. On a bright note, throughout various points in the campaign, there have been options to take part in side missions. These basically serve to either flesh out backstories, character relationships, or in the case of Caesar's missions, have a dedicated side plot. I gotta say, the side missions were by far the most challenging in a good way, especially Caesar's. While with the main campaign, a lot of the time I felt challenged, it was mostly due to unbalanced positioning or gimmicks in the later portion especially. I felt the side missions offered much more fair but challenging scenarios. Also, they offered interesting and unique gameplay scenarios as well. One of Caesar's missions, which I probably had some of the most fun with in the entire game, was a mission where you had to assault an enemy-held island. The challenge was due to overwhelming numbers and interesting defensive positions of the enemy, and trying to maneuver a D-Day style assault on the island and slowly wrestle control away bit by bit from the enemy was just so great. Another one of Caesar's missions was really interesting concept, as you don't have any bases and the enemy has a bunch of spread out territory across the map. You need to hop from base to base, taking it over slowly and carefully and making sure not to let any of your units die, as you can't produce any. Also, I love the little guy just egging Caesar on and his precious little face. A couple of the side missions do have this defend the base against waves of enemies type style, and these can be a little bit cheap as you have no way of knowing how many enemies will be spawning in and which direction without playing them through at least once. But overall, they added really interesting scenarios. I felt while the main missions were used to teach the players slowly about the game, the side missions were a chance for the devs to really take the gloves off and play with more difficult and interesting scenarios. So, looking back on the campaign, what do we got? Most of the start of the story, even to a very late stage, seems like a giant tutorial. They introduce new units all the way up into a very late stage of the campaign, and it's only in the last few missions that you're really allowed to properly play. And even then, the devs felt that the last few missions had to have other gimmicks instead of solid multiplayer style gameplay. However, the side missions do alleviate this to some degree. The starting missions in particular are just teaching you how to use units, grooves, and simple tactics. Once you're past the start, the AI really inhibits more interesting scenarios because of their intrinsic limitations. A lot of times, the difficulty just came down to throwing a shitload of enemies at you because they just aren't great at capturing bases or going on the offensive. Although the side missions are actually pretty good, especially Caesar's, and they play more with interesting scenarios. A lot of people comment on the game's difficulty, and I can definitely see how people not used to these type of games might find some missions quite difficult. It seemed like a lot of people struggled with the Fog of War missions in particular. The difficulty can stem from the AI having enormous starting advantages, which can be very punishing as there is no quick save, and if you lose, you have to start all over again, which for some of the later missions can be at least over an hour down the hole. By the end, it does start to feel a bit stale, because most mission objectives are just defeat the enemy commander or get a specific unit to a specific space, which again is a shame, especially when there are a few custom-made campaigns I played that use the game's engine to have some really interesting scenarios. There just aren't really many memorable scenarios, and it all kind of fades together, unfortunately. I know I've hammered this home a lot, but there is just not much in the way of replayability since you can't play as different commanders or explore branching paths. With all that in mind, I really doubt many people are going to remember the campaign as the strong point of Wargroove, or even really come back to it. Music in Wargroove is simple, fun, and on theme. The different tracks for each commander really help shape their personality. I will say, after a while, I just started listening to podcasts instead of the music, mostly because the gameplay lends itself to this pretty well. That being said, I probably listened to hundreds of hours of this music and barely noticed it, which probably means it's decent or, at the very least, unobtrusive. The game is not fully voice acted, only having sparse reoccurring bits of voice used for emphasis and mostly in cutscenes. It's cute and effective for what it is, but characters start to seem to have these catchphrases, and I wonder if dialogue was built around what would make sense to use these sound bites in. I do gotta say, I love the "hey, hey" rogue sound though. It seems a lot of people were asking for full voice acting in development, but the devs said by only focusing on small sound bits, this would allow them to up the production quality of a pixel art game without divorcing ourselves from the aesthetic, which seemed like a long-winded way of saying it would probably be cheaper. While I was doing research for this, it was interesting to see a few articles about how Chucklefish received some criticism for casting white actors for POC characters, specifically those in the DLC content. The devs did end up formally apologizing in a public statement, however. The design of the UI follows the same cutesy, pixelated art direction as the rest of the game. On the plus side of this decision, it really does look nice in its own way and helps drive home the personality of the game. On the other hand, there is a reason games have moved away from pixelated designs, and that's because attempting to display complex systems of information with these graphics can be very confusing to the players. For example, the pixelated art really works detrimentally when trying to present things like a multiplayer map screen, where the pixel art just can't support conveying as much information as needed. Basically, things like terrain and buildings get lost amongst the confusion. There are also some minor annoyances and some quality of life improvements that might have been implemented. I already mentioned the omission of a world map mission selector for the campaign. I've seen some people also making valid complaints over how skipping battle cutscenes can become really tedious as you have to do a 2-second hold instead of a single button press. Other UI complaints revolve around how discerning class strengths or weaknesses is not very clearly broadcasted to the player, as well as a lack of a redo button. It's hard to fault such a small team for minor annoyances, as I doubt they had a dedicated UI or UX expert on staff but it is interesting that some of these issues still persist even after major patches and a DLC has been released. The pixel graphics are a major draw of the game and are really lighthearted and obviously had a ton of love put into this. You can see this especially with all the little reaction movements with the character models, from Caesar sniffing around on the ground to Noru with arms folded. Even basic unit types like the archers have a ton of variation in the posing, which is really cool. The individual unit and commanders themselves also look excellent and are varied enough in design for the theme that they were going for. I understand the time and budget restraints, but one thing I was kind of let down on was the lack of aesthetic variation of the units for Requiem and the Outcast faction. It seems just a little lazy that they just reused Cherrystone models, especially since they actually had mockups done for the Outcast faction that just didn't make it in due to time restraints. Overall, the game has an extremely clear understanding of the art direction it's going for, and it wears its influence proudly on its sleeve. I think it absolutely accomplishes the mission it sets out to do, and I'm buying what it sells, to be honest. A lot of love and character has been put into this, and it's clear with the addition of things like the codex and the level of details of the characters. I think the game devs really love what they were making. That being said, I wouldn't say it necessarily manages to step out from the shadow of Advanced Wars, both stylistically or even gameplay-wise. It might just be a larger issue with nostalgia games in general. It's impossible not to compare the memory of the game to the game that it's trying to emulate, and it honestly might never stack up to that memory. Or maybe I'm just a jaded piece of shit now who can't find the same joy and magic in the way I used to as a kid. It's obvious the devs put a ton of effort into the extra content, and that is crucial as the campaign is really nothing to write home about. Featuring a map editor and campaign maker, arcade and puzzle challenges, and the ability to share creations and play multiplayer online is this game's saving grace in many ways. And these are really great additions to the game. Another major thing to note here is that for the game's price, both on release and even now, you get an amazing amount of content between the built-in campaign, puzzle mode, and arcade to the never-ending supply of fan-made maps and campaigns. Not to mention the free DLC, so you gotta give huge credit to Chucklefish for that. For the arcade mode, there is a focus on smaller and mirrored maps. Matches tend to be a bit more tiny and focused and just more straightforward. Basically, you choose a commander to use and are thrown into 5 back-to-back battles fought on 1v1 multiplayer maps. Different commanders have different opponents, but the final battle will almost always be against Elodie. You're basically awarded different star rankings depending on the difficulty you choose, and it unlocks new data entries in the codex for the characters you play as. I've seen a few people mention this mode does get a bit repetitive as the maps tend to repeat themselves for the different commanders, and people have described it kind of as filler. While I don't think this is fair necessarily, I would say that there is a lot to be desired in this mode as far as variation in the campaign. But on the plus side, it is a chance to play as the different commanders and kind of learn their strengths and weaknesses. Puzzle mode is a genuinely interesting mode where the player needs to win the match in a single turn, which requires extraordinarily precise tactics by the player. Many of the missions require the player to move units to a specific location in a specific order to allow for key opportunities. Fortunately, there is no downside to failing, so you can spend as long as you need experimenting. It's honestly a good change of pace from the long and super unforgiving missions in the campaign. Personally, I did a few of these from time to time to kind of break up the monotony of the longer missions in the campaign, but I didn't sink a huge amount of time into it. Some of the starting puzzles were nice little distractions, but the ending ones were extraordinarily daunting to me and seemed to require a huge amount of planning, a spreadsheet, and an entire pack of unfiltered cigarettes to figure out. So if that's your thing, go for it. One of the huge standout features definitely has to be the campaign and cutscene editor, which you can use locally or post your creations online for others to download. This section really might have benefited from a tutorial or a guide, as the interface is deceivingly simple and can be kind of hard to figure out how to do simple actions for first-timers. Full transparency, I did not try my hand at making a unique campaign, so I'm not going to speak about that too much, but I do love that it's an option in the first place. The amount of fan-made content is honestly a bit staggering, and the ways people have pushed the gameplay is super interesting. Some of the custom campaigns, like, for example, A Song in the Wind, were incredibly difficult compared to the main campaign, and it really showed how far the gameplay could be pushed in this engine. Another standout fan-made campaign has to be Tiny Groove, where essentially it focuses on extremely tiny map sizes. I didn't realize how much the map sizes and small details like these could impact the gameplay, but it made me completely change how I viewed some of my tactics. It is interesting that some of these concepts, like the aforementioned tiny map sizes, weren't really explored in the main content of the game. But these modes, which can take the gameplay into a totally different direction from the original, is honestly a joy to see, and it's cool to see how much the engine can be stretched. Of course, with the good, you also get the bad, and you can really see how the engine struggles when it's used in ways it's not supposed to. You can clearly see this in some of the larger player-made maps, such as Hyrule, where the AI would take forever to move, but maybe that's because I was playing on the Switch. Also, have to give a huge shout out to the cutscene editor, which seems like people have had a little bit too much fun with, and I might be guilty of that as well. Multiplayer is a huge draw to the game, and is honestly why most players would probably come back to it over the long term. You can play locally, which I consistently play a lot over plane and bus trips, and it supports up to 4 players where you pass around the Switch, which gives me flashbacks to when I was a little shit on road trips with my family, playing Advanced Wars with my brother and his cheating ways. There is also an online mode, which, again, full transparency, I didn't explore much of. However, there are a couple different modes, including quick play, hosting/lobbies, and a co-op campaign. I didn't play any online multiplayer, so I can't say how active the servers are in 2023, but people have had generally positive things to say about it. There seems to be an active community, Discord servers, and a fair amount of competitor players out there, which it's great that it's still going on. Overall, even if I didn't really interact with this feature of the game very heavily, I can't imagine the game without it, as the gameplay lends itself so well to multiplayer play, and it's good that it's still here to drive the community forward. The DLC was a free addition to the game, released in February 2020. Double Trouble, and I am so sorry for the expression, doubles down on the multiplayer aspect of the game by focusing on co-op style gameplay. The campaign basically has you jumping around the same map as the main campaign, but this time the focus is on heist style missions where you are stealing gold from each of the 4 factions in the game. Essentially, the story follows the outlaw family of Wulfric and his twin children, Errol and Orla, after one of their family members is kidnapped by the villainous rival outlaw Vesper. We are essentially tasked with collecting enough ransom money to exchange for the safe return of our family member. Every mission in the Double Trouble campaign is designed around co-op play, and as such has a very distinct feel from the main game. I played through this with a friend, and it was really quite the challenge to our friendship because these missions are pretty hard and unforgiving. The campaign also features a really gorgeous outlaw slash heist theme campaign map, which is great because you'll probably spend more time here given the campaign has a freeform style, with the path branching after the first mission to each of the 4 factions' territories. Although the order doesn't actually change anything, it does make the system feel a bit more dynamic. I'm guessing the game devs seem to have a ton of fun with this and played around much more with different scenarios. And it honestly has a really great amount of variety in the gameplay, which the main campaign was sorely lacking. Sometimes your forces are in the same area of the map, and other times they are completely separated. Other times you and your allies have different objectives or goals they need to work toward together. It seems like, in general, the devs really wanted to expand from the generic mission scenarios introduced in the main campaign, and the co-op style gameplay really allows for much more varied scenarios here. One downside is that the intrinsic design of co-op gameplay, some of the missions can drag on for a very long time, and if you lose again, you gotta start all the way over. Can also be tricky to coordinate complex operations with a partner, especially when your forces are grouped together. But on the plus side of this, because criticals can be activated by allied units, you can have some really interesting options open up gameplay-wise. It might have been interesting to explore just some shorter and sweeter style missions in the campaign, because the entire runtime of the campaign is honestly maybe a bit too long for 2 people potentially sitting down on a couch. But also, it's hard to fault a free edition since the DLC is all free. It is a shame again that there are no just regular, straight up, interesting multiplayer style missions added in the campaign, but they did introduce new arcade missions, so you can kind of scratch that itch there. It's also important to note that you can absolutely tackle the campaign solo as well. Also, if it's your thing, the DLC added a few more editor options as well, including a volcano map theme, which is good, I guess. At the end of the day, it's a free addition to the game, and it's just awesome that they added so much content here to begin with. Speaking of additional content, there have been 2 new units added here in the DLC, which are the Thief and the Rifleman. Both are pretty interesting concepts, however, kind of niche in their gameplay, which I guess isn't necessarily a bad thing. The Thief can steal from enemy buildings, which instantly makes them neutral and gives him 300 gold if they bring it back to the newly introduced camp building. But the annoying thing is, after they steal from a building, their movement is greatly restricted. Also, they have an even more niche use where they can steal from enemies' HQs for even more cash, but this has got to be pretty rare in actual gameplay, and I was honestly never able to pull this off like a single time. The big issue with the thieves is that in order to get them in position and then get them back again, it just takes so long, and it's usually not really viable to go through all that trouble, when on the other hand, you can just push out other more practical unit types. That being said, they don't really ruin the balance or anything, and it's nice to have more options instead of less. And also, I could see how in the right situation, they could change the balance of a match if played correctly. On the other end of things, we have the Rifleman, who is a sniper-type unit able to take out units from a long range. However, they can only shoot in a straight line and are limited to 3 shots before needing to reload, which takes a turn. They can't move and attack or hit airborne enemies or people in forests, so again, it kind of makes these guys extremely situational. That being said, I can see how insanely useful they might be in those situations, as you can pick off key units like mages or even archers, even if they are meat shielded by cheap infantry. Another caveat, however, is that they are mostly effective against other infantry and not too much against other unit types. The impression I got was that the riflemen were introduced to stop a tactic which seemed to be happening prior to the DLC in multiplayer games, where players would just make a slow moving wall of death with spearmen and trebs. Having these units, you can pick apart enemy formations with relative ease. One negative thing about these units is that they aren't really available on any of the vanilla maps, since both new units require the new building, the hideout. So given the fact that these guys already have a very niche use, on top of the fact that most of the maps don't even support them, you're probably going to see very little of them outside the DLC. The DLC also introduces 3 new commanders, all belonging to the Outlaw faction and having their own unique abilities. We got the Big Boy Wolfer, who can launch allies across gaps and large spaces, or catapult enemies far away from the action while additionally dealing splash damage. Then you have the twins Errol and Orla, who can perform either a damaging or healing AoE move, which lasts multiple turns but is honestly a bit tricky to pull off, at least in multiplayer games. That being said, her fire move can be absolutely devastating in enemy bases and cutting off areas for the enemy. Honestly, the twins are extremely versatile and niche commanders, and they're really a fun, unique addition to the game. Finally, you got Vesper, who uses Smoke Shroud ability, which basically prevents all units inside the area of effect from being targeted, which can be insanely useful as she is the only commander that can use her groove anywhere on the map. The commanders, as with the new units, add some interesting niche style powers and are welcome additions to the rest of the commander roster, utilizing some really interesting mechanics. At the end of the day, the DLC adds a bunch of new content, interesting scenarios, and spoilers, a cat. All for free, so it's really hard to fault anything here. The tone of the DLC goes pretty much strictly for lighthearted and a humorous tone, which I think the game art style really works well with. Again, I think it reinforces that this game really was a passion project by the devs, and they wanted to just continue the shelf life of this IP by introducing more content. So, honestly, hats off to them. Having last played an Advanced Wars style game when I was probably in middle school, it was really interesting coming back to this style of game. And more than that, seeing that there still is a market and demographic for this type of game. If you are a fan of Advanced War style games, and to a lesser extent something like your Fire Emblems, this is an easy game to recommend, where it can absolutely scratch that black hole of an itch that seemingly no other game has given in the past couple decades. Okay, so now that we've talked about some of the positive things, let's mention some of the not so positive things. Although Wargroove more than fulfills its mission to emulate the Advanced Wars style of gameplay, I wouldn't say it does enough to necessarily distinguish itself from what it tries to imitate. And that's really honestly a blessing and a curse. I can't really see this IP standing on its own 2 feet, so to speak, and being able to be discussed without bringing up its influences. What it does do effectively is bring the spotlight back on these type of strategy games and say loudly, these are still solid style games and there's still a market here. That all being said, it is kind of a shame that we're decades past the Advanced Wars series, and there is a deep, dark side of me that asks, is this honestly the best that we can do almost 20 years on, just trying to emulate the exact same game with just some minor changes? To be fair, that's a dark side of me, and I know that Wargroove brings a lot of new things to the table here, but I do think this is a valid point. On the flip side, every ounce of this game just exudes a pure love from the developers, and you can really tell by the sheer amount of cheap and free content that the devs were very passionate about this. This is apparent in the small little details, the codex, animations like Caesar sniffing the ground, and the facts they included about the characters, for example, the fact that Valder hates oranges. It all has a charm that I hope would be hard to fake, and it's really great to see. The gameplay is easy enough to pick up even for newcomers to the genre, but I would say complex enough for more serious players to have something to really latch onto. although I could see how the gameplay might get a little stale after a while, and there could have been more depth added with additional unit types, changes to the campaign mode, and differing abilities for factions/commanders. With the advent of Advanced Wars Reboot to come out sometime in 2023, it's interesting to examine Wargroove and its strengths and weaknesses. It'll again be interesting to see if the Advanced Wars Reboot learns anything from Wargroove, but honestly, after looking at gameplay footage, my hopes are not too high. But we can hope. At the end of the day, I'm happy this game exists, and it's been a great companion for long airplane and car rides with friends, and it's just so great to see the spirit of this genre live on, even if nothing much has been done to necessarily advance it. It's a charming game, and even after spending countless of hours for it on this review, I can still see myself coming back to it, so that definitely has to count for something. Okay, so real talk, I just want to say this was my first full video essay, and I got to say it was an experience. I didn't really fully realize just how much time and work it actually takes, and a lot of the video and audio editing, if you can't tell, I had to learn on the fly. So I really do apologize for any inconsistent quality the video might have suffered. All of that being said, if you watch this, honestly, thank you so much. I really do welcome all the comments and critiques, as this was my first time doing this, and I really want to keep doing it and improve. If you see some small amount of potential here, I would really love any support I can get. I imagine the better I get at these, the less time it'll take to produce, but yeah, it takes a lot of time. If you want to find a way to do that, you can follow the Patreon link here, and if you have any suggestions for my next game, I'm happy to check them out as well, because I honestly have no idea what I'm going to do. Although after doing this video, I kind of want to do more of the war series or strategy games, but I'm not really sure if I want to pigeon myself into one genre. I'm also toying with the idea of starting a Discord server, but I don't know, do people do that now? Anyway, thank you so much again. I really appreciate you guys taking the time to listen to me ramble.